Boats appear on the water before anyone can ring a bell. No warning, no messenger riding in from the border, just the sound of paddles cutting fast through the lake at dawn, hundreds of them, moving in formation, and by the time anyone in the capital understands what's happening, the fight is already inside the city. This isn't a siege. There's no time for a siege. This is the single fastest collapse of one of the most powerful empires Southeast Asia has ever seen, and it happened in less time than it takes you to watch this video. You're standing for a moment in the year 1177 in a city built to look eternal. Stone towers reaching toward the sky. Reservoirs the size of small seas. A civilization so wealthy and so confident, it spent generations carving gods into rock instead of building walls out of it. And that single decision, gods over walls, is about to cost them everything. The city was called Yasodharapura. Today we call the region Angkor, and you've probably seen photos of it without knowing this story happened here. Let's back up for a second because you need to understand exactly how confident this empire was before you understand exactly how fast it fell. By the mid-1100s, the Khmer Empire controlled a stretch of Southeast Asia that spanned much of modern Cambodia, parts of Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Its capital was arguably the largest pre-industrial urban settlement on Earth at the time. Historians studying the remains of the city's canals, roads, and reservoirs estimate it may have supported close to 1 million people, spread across its wider metropolitan area, centuries before any European city came close to that scale. The empire's kings didn't build fortresses. They built temples, massive ones, sandstone towers with carvings so intricate that stonemasons spent decades on a single wall. This was a civilization spending its wealth on permanence, on eternity, on impressing gods rather than repelling enemies, which meant the capital itself was protected by something much less impressive: wooden palisades, timber fencing, the kind of defense you'd expect around a farming village, not around the beating heart of an empire. Now hold that detail. You're going to need it in about 90 seconds. To the east, across the mountains, sat a smaller but fiercely persistent rival, the kingdom of Champa, centered along the coast of what's now central Vietnam. The Khmer and the Cham had been fighting each other on and off for close to 2 centuries by this point. Raids, counter-raids, shifting alliances, the normal rhythm of 2 ambitious neighbors who both wanted the same trade routes and the same fertile land. But in 1177, a Cham king named Jayavarman IV decided to stop playing that slow game entirely. Instead of marching an army overland, the way every previous invasion had come, he built a fleet. War canoes packed with soldiers, and instead of following the coast, he sailed them up the Mekong River, then cut inland along a smaller waterway, then straight into the massive freshwater lake that sat right beside the Khmer capital, the Tonle Sap. Nobody in Angkor was watching the water. Every previous threat in living memory had come by land, over the mountains, with weeks of warning. The lake was supposed to be safe. The lake was where you fished, where you traded, where children learned to swim. The lake was also, it turns out, the single most undefended route straight into the heart of the empire. The Cham fleet crossed the Tonle Sap and struck before the city had any real chance to organize a defense. What followed wasn't a clean, orderly battle. It was closer to chaos on open water, boats colliding, soldiers fighting hand to hand, on unstable wooden platforms, men going overboard into a lake that was itself its own kind of danger. The Tonle Sap wasn't empty water. It was full of crocodiles, and as soldiers fell from the fighting boats, some of them didn't drown. Something else got to them first. We know this in more than just written accounts. Decades later, Khmer artists carved the entire battle into stone, panel after panel, along the walls of a temple called the Bayon. And if you visit Angkor today and know where to look, you can see it exactly as it was remembered. 2 tiers of men in each boat, rowers below, fighters above, bodies falling into the water, and crocodiles closing in on the fallen. Historians and art historians who've studied these reliefs in detail, described them as some of the most vivid, almost documentary-style battle scenes to survive from the entire ancient world. Not idealized heroism, but the actual ugly texture of a naval fight going wrong for the people losing it. And the Khmer were losing it, with the lake breached and the capital's flimsy wooden defenses doing almost nothing to slow the advance. Cham forces poured into Yasodharapura. The city was sacked, looted, burned in places, and in the chaos the reigning Khmer king, a ruler named Tribhuvanadityavarman, was killed. Sit with that for a second. This wasn't a border skirmish. This was the literal death of the sitting monarch inside his own capital, in a surprise attack that the empire's entire defensive strategy had never accounted for the people actually living through it. This must have felt like the end of the world they knew. Generations of stability, generations of monumental building projects meant to last 10,000 years, undone in what was probably a matter of hours. Imagine waking up in a city that has never once been seriously threatened in your lifetime, and by nightfall, watching soldiers who don't speak your language walking through streets that were supposed to be untouchable. Here's where the story does something most people don't expect. The empire didn't stay conquered. Somewhere in the chaos, or perhaps already positioned elsewhere in the kingdom, was a man in his 50s, old by the standards of the time, to be starting anything resembling a new chapter in his life. His name was Jayavarman, and up to this point, historians studying the surviving inscriptions don't have a fully clear picture of exactly where he'd spent the previous years, though most agree he had royal blood and had been waiting, watching, or possibly campaigning elsewhere while the crisis unfolded. What we do know is what happened next. Jayavarman didn't try to negotiate. He didn't wait for someone else to fix it. In his 50s, an age at which most rulers of the era were already thinking about succession rather than conquest, he began raising and leading a Khmer counteroffensive against the very Cham forces who just humiliated his kingdom. This took years, not days. From 1177 until 1181, the fighting dragged on, retaking territory, rebuilding an army, pushing the Cham fleet back across the same waters they'd used to devastate the capital. And in a detail that feels almost too poetic to be true, the decisive naval battle that finally turned the tide happened. Once again on the Tonle Sap, the same lake, the same kind of warfare, except this time, the Khmer were the ones who understood exactly what they were fighting for. In 1181, with the Cham forces finally driven out and the kingdom stabilized, Jayavarman was crowned king, not as a young prince inheriting a throne, as a man in his mid-50s who had personally led the fight to take it back. And then he did something the empire had never done before at this scale. He stopped relying on wooden palisades. Jayavarman VII, as he's known to history, built Angkor Wat, a new, massively fortified capital with real defensive walls, gates guarded by towering stone faces, and at its center, a temple unlike anything built before it, the Bayon. The same temple whose walls carry those extraordinarily detailed carvings of the naval battle that had nearly ended everything. He didn't hide the humiliation of 1177. He carved it into the walls of his own capital in permanent stone for every future generation to see. Not as shame, but as proof. This happened. We nearly lost everything, and we came back anyway. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. The kind of thing that connects a battle from nearly 900 years ago to something happening in your own life right now, whether you realize it or not. Angkor Wat and the Bayon are still standing. Millions of tourists walk through those gates every single year, take photographs of those enormous stone fosses, and wander past the exact carved panels depicting men falling out of boats and crocodiles closing in beneath them, almost none of them knowing that they're looking at a documentary. Not a myth, not a decorative pattern, an actual eyewitness-style record of the worst day this empire ever lived through, carved by the people who survived it, on the orders of the man who spent 4 years clawing the kingdom back from the brink. You've probably walked past something similar without knowing it too. A plaque, a monument, a building, rebuilt after a fire or a flood, standing on the exact spot where something devastating happened. With no obvious sign of the crisis, it survived. We build over our disasters constantly. We rebuild and rebrand and move forward, and the evidence of how close things came to falling apart gets quietly folded into the architecture, waiting for someone to actually look closely enough to notice it. The Khmer Empire didn't collapse in 1177. It came devastatingly close. A king was killed. A capital was sacked in what was likely no more than a single catastrophic day. And the empire's actual survival came down to one aging, determined man willing to spend 4 years of his life clawing it back, one battle at a time, on the exact same water where it had all gone wrong. The next time you see a photograph of Angkor, those famous stone faces, that enormous temple silhouette against the sunrise, remember that underneath the postcard image is a story about how quickly confidence can turn into catastrophe, and how much longer it takes to build it back. Somewhere along a quiet stretch of water in Cambodia, the reflection is still there if you know where to look. A city that thought it was untouchable. Boats that appeared before anyone could ring a bell, and a man who refused, at 50-something years old, to let that be the end of the story.